Hello, and welcome to This Is Monsters. If you don't already know, this show is produced with seasons that are themed, and we're currently on Season 18, Killer Kids. I figured I'd add a little opening to the episodes to make sure everyone knows the theme, and to make sure YouTube knows the narration isn't AI. If you enjoy the channel, not necessarily the crimes, you can hit like on the video and subscribe for weekly stories. You can also check out my other channel, Somewhere Sinister, which is not entirely true crime, but true crime adjacent. A link is in the description. Thanks so much. When two beloved professors from Dartmouth College were found murdered in their home in 2001, authorities were baffled at who could have wanted the couple dead. They considered an angry student and another professor who was trying to take one of their jobs, but they only hit dead ends. When the evidence pointed towards two teenage boys from good families who had done well in school and had no criminal records, they had a hard time believing they were hardened killers. It turns out that you can't judge a book by its cover. This is Monsters. Robert Tulloch was born on May 8, 1983 in North Pomfret, Vermont, to Mike and Diane Tulloch. He was one of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Mike was an introverted man who had suffered from depression, and people that knew the family said that Diane was the one who dealt with everything outside of the household. In 1990, the family decided to try something new and moved to Jensen Beach, Florida. Other kids in the area found the family to be a bit strange. They were outsiders, so the children were picked on by older kids. It wasn't only the children that people found strange, though. In the neighborhood, the Tulloch's property was always overgrown and ill-kept. At social events, Mike and Diane were withdrawn and quiet. One neighbor would later say, quote, "They weren't what you'd call an asset to the neighborhood." The Tullochs had only been in Florida for 2 years when they put their house up for sale and planned to move back up north. Florida was the opposite of what they were used to, which shouldn't have been surprising. The Tullochs were earthy people who liked to hike and ski, not sunbathe and surf, so they moved back to Vermont and settled in the small town of Chelsea. Small town Vermont was definitely the right place for the Tullochs. Mike had a workshop in their new house and was able to start his own business as a finish carpenter. Diane, who had been a stay-at-home mother until then, started taking nursing classes. She would eventually get her nursing license in 1995 and begin work as a caretaker in people's homes. Robert was in the 6th grade by then, and their new house was big enough that he finally had his own room. That new privacy would go along with the independence he learned in school. Rob would form a special connection with a teacher at the K-12 school that he attended. He wrote in a high school essay, quote, "6th grade, the year of my awakening. DeRoss Kellogg, one of the best teachers I will ever know, taught me to be independent in school. In his class, I learned to distinguish myself and became a separate and confident individual." Through primary and middle school, Robert was seen as a bright and attentive student. He and his group of friends were interested in learning and were always looking for new challenges. The group of students skipped pre-algebra and in 7th grade went straight to algebra class with the 8th graders. Robert's youth seemed to be on the same track as other young boys in the area. He had a paper route and played sports. Little League was where he met most of his friends, who were also smart and athletic. The group played around and did what most kids did in the 90s in small-town America. But as Robert got older, he started showing a more sullen personality. By the time he reached high school, his older sister Becky had graduated and moved out to attend nursing school. His parents expected him to pick up the slack around the house, with Rob complaining to friends that he was constantly doing dishes, vacuuming, or mopping the floor. Robert's next oldest sibling was Julie, who had a brain abnormality that caused her to have developmental delays and impulse control problems. Due to her disability, she wasn't expected to do chores around the house, and that annoyed Robert. He started complaining that he did everything around the house and yelled at Julie about it, and it was one of the few times that Mike would get upset at him. His father told him he couldn't get angry at her. Though friends said that Robert didn't make a big deal about it at the time, his father's reaction likely compounded the animosity he was feeling. James Parker was born on May 24, 1984 in Chelsea to John and Joan Parker. The Parkers had met in San Diego and quickly fell in love, but they didn't want to start a family in a big city. When they visited friends in Vermont, they fell in love with Chelsea's quaint small-town charm and eventually made the move. They had a daughter in 1981 before having James in 1984. James would spend his youth going by Jimmy and eventually Jim. The Parkers were the opposite of the Tullocks when it came to social perceptions. John was a successful building contractor and was involved in a number of community organizations. He was the chairman of the recreation committee, the JV basketball coach, and a player on the men's basketball league. He had built their house on a 19-acre property they purchased after moving to town. His business had contracted work from Mike before their sons ever became friends. Joan had at one point been a nationally ranked racquetball player who continued to compete well into motherhood. She went on to coach the sport in nearby Barre, Vermont. Jimmy's childhood would be considered idyllic by many. The large property gave him room to run and explore. There would end up being 2 tree houses, a tire swing, and a basketball hoop for hours of entertainment. He enjoyed the spotlight and was known as a bit of a showman. His father coached him in basketball, but Jimmy never took the game seriously. He went on to take some martial arts classes and then started on music. He took piano lessons and then got a bass guitar and a drum set. In school, he was seen as an intelligent kid who likely caused trouble as the class clown because he wasn't challenged enough. Jimmy was in the same grade as Robert's younger brother, Keenan, so he initially started hanging out with them both, but over time he became better friends with Rob. People said it made sense as Keenan was more introverted like their father, but Robert was energetic and outgoing. From 9th grade on, Robert and Jimmy plus a few other boys were a crew that spent all their time together. They talked about life and what they could do, insisting most people weren't making enough out of their lives. Unfortunately, the lack of driver's licenses would hold the teens back at first. They spent their free time playing Nintendo 64 inside or swimming, building forts, or playing tag outside. While building one fort behind a friend's house, the boys had to climb a rock face in order to access the area, and that's when Robert and Jimmy discovered their love of rock climbing. That would become a new challenge that the pair would take on together, giving them something to focus on in the small town and ultimately strengthening their bond. As the boys came to the end of high school, they started acting more and more on impulse. They would steal and break into houses while the owners were out of town. They had gotten driver's licenses and cars, so getting around town was made much easier. They were able to get around easier, but one thing they didn't really do was party. Drinking and smoking pot was never their thing, so it left them with idle time. Time they would end up using to get in trouble and talk about the future. Eventually, the boys in the crew all started going their separate ways. Most of them were preparing for college, but that wasn't a direction that Robert and Jim wanted to take. In 1999, Robert and Jim thought it would be funny for Robert to run for student body president. It was basically a catch-22. To prove that Robert could be the school president, but he didn't really want to be the president. With an aggressive campaign, Robert ended up winning and was the student body president in his junior year. The problem was that Robert wasn't interested in doing any of the actual work that came with being the president. Eventually, his vice president and some other members of the student council impeached him from the position. In all of the time that Robert and Jim spent talking about the future, they finally made a decision as to what they wanted to do. They wanted to completely start over, and in order to do that, they would need to start a campaign of murder and robbery. As they drove around town, they would talk at length about their problems and how they could get away from them. They talked about joining the British Special Forces, but decided that going through training would be too hard, so they decided they would train themselves to become ruthless killers. They would kill people and take what they needed. They imagined themselves stealing boats and sailing to remote islands where they could hunt with spears. It was a lot of childish fantasies that would be relatively harmless if it wasn't for the plan to murder. On July 18, 2000, someone knocked on the door of the vacation home owned by Andrew and Diane Patty. The couple lived in Long Island, New York, but had purchased the quiet getaway in Vershire less than 10 minutes west of Chelsea earlier that year. On the 17th, Andrew took their 11-year-old son and their dog out to the house to spend a father-son week together during the boys' summer break from school. Diane stayed behind in New York to give them some time together. Sometime after 9 p.m., Andrew and his son were settled in on the couch when the knock came. When Andrew went to the door, he saw a teenager leaning close to the door's window who announced he was having car trouble. Andrew was uneasy about who was at his door. He was a cautious man, but not entirely paranoid. Since purchasing the house, he had 2 other people knock on the door claiming to have car trouble, and he had helped them both. They had gently knocked on the door and then stepped back into clear view, making Andrew sense they weren't a danger. That was not what was happening now, though. The teen at the door was right up at the window, almost demanding to be let in. Andrew didn't hesitate when he bluntly said no. The stranger insisted, so Andrew decided to flash the Glock he kept on him to make sure the teen was aware that he was willing and ready to protect himself and his son. Then he told the stranger that he would call a tow truck for him. When Andrew picked up the phone, it was dead. He then realized that the person at the door had cut the phone line. The stranger never reappeared at the door, but Andrew stayed up all night guarding against a potential attack. Fortunately, it was an attack that would never come, but if it had, it would have been brutal. It would turn out that Robert and Jim had been planning to kill whoever was in the house. That's known because they spent hours digging a grave 5 foot or 1.5 meters long and 3 foot or 1 meter deep. They each had a hunting knife and intended to convince the resident to open the door so they could rush in, kill them, and bury the bodies. It's unknown what their plan was after that, but Andrew was lucky to have been able to convince the teens that it would have been more trouble than it was worth. On January 20th, 2001, Robert and Jim were out in town looking for another victim. Their failure at the Patty residence didn't give them any pause. They simply refined their plan. Instead of claiming car trouble, they would use their youth to their advantage. They would knock on a door and tell whoever answered that they were doing an environmental survey for school. Once they were inside, they would strike. They seemed to enjoy the fact that the plan would need to be carried out in broad daylight. They wanted to take big risks, feeling like they were smarter than everyone else. They had actually set out the day before but lost control of Jim's 1987 silver Audi in the snowy conditions, so the next day they swapped it out for Jim's mother's green Subaru. They had scoped out a new house on North Holly Road on the outskirts of Rochester, Vermont. It was about an hour away, but they knew the area had nice houses and the people who lived there likely had money. The 2 teens grabbed backpacks out of the car and headed up to the front door, which was answered by 65-year-old Franklin Sanders. Robert started giving his story about being students looking to do interviews about the environment, but Franklin had been in the middle of a project and was completely preoccupied. He told the boys no, and before they could get out another word, he slammed the door. That was it. No murder, no robbery. As Robert and Jim drove back toward Chelsea, they told each other they wouldn't give up. They would keep trying, honing their method until they got it right. Then the topic of Hanover came up. Hanover was just over the border in New Hampshire and was known as an area with more money than the areas they had already been trying to hit. They also thought it would work well as they were known to not like the city. It was a college town, and Robert and Jim were turned off by the whole preppy atmosphere. Instead of turning off to head back to Chelsea, they continued to Hanover to scope out some possible targets. The Zantop family immigrated to the United States from Germany in early 1976. Parents Rolf and Susanna had traveled by ship with their daughters, Veronica and Mariana, only 4 and 2 years old respectively at the time. The ship arrived at the port of Montreal and friends picked them and their possessions up and drove them 4 hours south to Hanover. Despite both being from Germany, Rolf and Susanna met in the U.S. while they were both attending Stanford University in California. Rolf was born in 1938, and a year later, Germany would invade Poland, leading his home country into World War II. His family moved around Europe throughout his youth to keep out of harm's way during the war, and Rolf returned to Germany for college. After receiving a degree in geology, he moved overseas and got another geology degree from the University of Washington. Then Rolf enrolled at Stanford to pursue his Ph.D. Susanna was born in 1945, just a few months after the fall of the Third Reich. She was a gifted child, having skipped several grades. Outside of her academic achievements, she was a talented piano player, played badminton, and read any book she could get her hands on. Susanna received a degree in political science in Germany before enrolling at Stanford to continue her studies. After Holf completed his PhD and Susanna had her master's degree, the couple moved to Argentina where Holf worked as a geologist for a mining company. They got married in 1970 and soon Susanna was pregnant. They relocated to Spain where Holf worked for another mining company. They had their second child while in Spain and eventually he was recruited to be a professor at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. He loved working in the field, but as a professor he would be able to spend more time with his family, so he accepted the job. Once in the States, Holf dove headfirst into his work as a professor and Susanna quickly went to work getting another degree. She would ultimately complete a PhD in comparative literature at Harvard University. She had already done some teaching at Dartmouth, but with her doctorate she became a professor of German and comparative literature. She published her first book about the German poet Heine in 1988, the same year that Holf co-authored a book about mineral economics. The couple were devoted to their fields, especially to teaching others about it. Their dedication was recognized by many faculty and students at the college. In 1992, Veronica and Mariana had graduated high school and were off to college. Veronica was studying to become a doctor at the University of Washington in Seattle, and Mariana attended the Columbia School of Public Health in New York to become a nurse midwife. Around then, the Zantops moved into a house in Etna, just east of Hanover. In 1996, the couple completed the process of becoming United States citizens and continued their work teaching young students about their chosen fields. On Friday, January 26, 2001, Holf and Susanna had spent their workdays at Dartmouth like any other day. Then they visited with friends over dinner and all went to see a movie before calling it a night. The Zantops had plans that weekend to do some cross-country skiing and to attend the 90th birthday for one of the college's retired geology professors. The next day, they had plans to have dinner with Roxana Verona, another Dartmouth professor who had purchased the Zantops home when they moved to Etna. They were fast friends, and Roxana was planning to bring a salad to go along with the dinner. The following morning, Holf and Susanna got up and did their usual weekend routine of drinking tea and sending emails. Later in the morning, there was a knock at the door, and when Holf opened it, he was greeted by two teenage boys who were looking to interview him about the environment for a school project. Susanna was making them lunch, but being a teacher, Holf didn't want to turn the students away, so he ushered them inside and closed the door. Roxana arrived at the Zantops' house at 6:30 p.m., but there was no answer at the door. Being good friends, she let herself in and called out to Susanna, but the house remained quiet. When she stepped further into the house, she came to the study and saw Susanna laying face down on the floor in a pool of blood. Then she saw Holf a few feet away laying on his side covered in blood. The room was a mess, with a card table overturned and books on the shelves out of place. Thinking that the attacker still might be there, Roxana ran outside, jumped into her car and drove over to the neighbor's house, spaced further apart due to the rural area. That was the home of Bob and Audrey McCollum, who were shocked at what Roxanne was telling them. Audrey called 911 while Bob and their adult daughter Cindy raced to the Zantops' house. Bob was a doctor and likely hoped there would be something he could do to help his neighbors, but it was unfortunately too late. Holf and Susanna were already dead by the time Roxanne had arrived. Soon, officers from the Hanover Police Department and the New Hampshire State Police were on the scene. They cleared the house and called for the medical examiner. In the kitchen, the makings of soup and sandwiches were on the counter, showing that the Zantops had been interrupted while preparing lunch. There was a trail of blood leading from the study to the front door and multiple bloody boot prints in the entryway and outside. When investigators searched the study, they found two black plastic knife sheaths on the floor near where the bodies had been. Investigators immediately started speculating as to who could have committed the brutal murder of two professors who didn't really have much friction in their lives. Was it an angry student who received a bad grade? Was it a robbery gone wrong? There weren't a lot of clues, but with the two knife sheaths in hand, detectives set out to uncover who had taken the lives of the Zantops. Robert and Jim were not the genius criminals they thought they were. They made many mistakes during the course of the murder. The most obvious was that they fled the scene without the sheaths. They jumped into the green Subaru and started backing out of the long driveway, only to have their breath fog up the windows. They had to hang their heads out of the windows, with Jim yelling out to Rob, asking if he was clear. The fact that the houses had some distance between them was the only reason they didn't attract attention. They made it out of the driveway, and Robert noticed he had a cut above his right knee. Then he opened the wallet he had taken from Rolf and counted the cash inside. $340. That was what the Xantops' lives were worth to the two teenage murderers fleeing the scene of the crime. A murder-robbery spree was their grand plan to raise money to start new lives in Australia. They estimated they would need to raise $10,000 before they left, and the money from their first crime made almost no dent in that number. Before returning home, the teens stopped at a turnoff to clean as much blood off of them as they could. It was then that Jim noticed the sheaths were missing. They searched their backpacks but couldn't find them, so they continued on to change their clothes and would figure out a plan after that. They stopped at Robert's house where he changed his clothes, and then they went to Jim's house where they stashed the knives, Rolf's wallet, and some other things in an outside shed for the time being. After Jim changed his clothes, the boys drove to the Barnes & Noble bookstore and tried to find books about how to kill people. Unsurprisingly, they didn't find anything useful, so they looked at some magazines for a while and then left. Once the initial panic wore off, the killers decided that they needed to return to the Xantops and get the knife sheaths. They drove back across the border into New Hampshire and to Etna, but when they arrived at the house, it was already crawling with police. They rolled by the house and then went right back to Chelsea, where they went into Robert's bedroom and hid for the night. When the autopsies were complete, the medical examiner reported that Rolf had died from multiple stab wounds injuring his airway, heart, and one lung. Susanna had also been stabbed multiple times with injuries to her skull, brain, major blood vessels, airway, intestine, and spleen. The ME noted that they were likely relatively quick deaths. Not that that would be any comfort to the people that knew them. The Xantops were loved by many: friends, co-workers, students, and obviously their daughters. Investigators quickly started working on identifying the knives that the sheaths belonged to. They learned that they went to a SOG Seal 2000 knife. It had a 7-inch or almost 18-centimeter blade and a contoured black handle. The knives had been on the market for about 5 years, but the sheaths had only been recently released. Investigators were able to narrow their search to knives that had been sold in the previous 10 months. From there, they were able to get a list from SOG of all the Seal 2000 knives with sheaths that were sold in that time period and began the long, arduous task of reviewing the sales. Then authorities were given a huge break when Rolf's assistant said that he knew someone who might want to kill the professor. A geologist named Stanley Williams lived in Arizona, but he was in town that weekend to attend the same birthday party Rolf was supposed to be at. Stanley had been injured during a volcano explosion which left him with brain damage, and people said his mood was much angrier after the incident. At the party, the assistant overheard Stanley say that he wanted to teach at Dartmouth, but the only job he was qualified for was already filled. Of course, he was talking about Rolf's job. At the start of the party, Stanley was his usual grumpy self, but during the second half, the assistant said his mood was quite a bit better. Was that because he knew there would soon be a job opening at the college? Investigators immediately found the car Stanley had rented while in town, and in the trunk they found a cardboard box with a reddish-brown substance on it. After flying out to interview the geologist in person, investigators found no evidence that he was involved in the murders or in any conspiracy to have the Xantops murdered. The substance on the cardboard box turned out to not be blood. On February 14, 2001, a detective was reviewing the list of knife retailers when he noticed an online seller had ordered 124 Seal 2000 knives, which was far more than any other seller. The company was based in Massachusetts, about an hour south of Boston, so the detective called the local police and asked them to set up an interview. James Fox, owner of Fox Firearms, was only happy to help, and when he was questioned about the knives, he explained that they were a hot seller and he had already sold 84 of the 124 he had received. Those sales were made to 83 different customers. All of them had purchased a single knife with the exception of one, Jim Parker from Chelsea, Vermont. Investigators called James and he was able to send over the emails he had gotten in relation to the sale. Over the course of a few emails, Jim had negotiated a price for 2 SOG Seal 2000 knives, then he sent over a money order and soon received the knives in the mail. Robert and Jim tried to play it cool after the murder. They pretended everything was normal as they planned their escape from the area. They still had some misguided idea that they would be able to take off and live a life of adventure, stealing and killing. They had the $340 from Holf's wallet, and Jim sold some musical instruments and his snowboard. That gave them a little more than $800, but after buying some climbing gear, they were down to $500. The next day, the two teens drove to a bus station not far from Hanover. They got bus tickets to Amarillo, Texas, and headed out of the area. By the time they got to St. Louis, they both realized that they had underestimated the cross-country journey. They were already running low on money, and it looked like the cut on Robert's leg was getting infected. Jim called his parents and told them they had taken a trip but weren't having a good time and needed to come home. They ended up flying back to Vermont from St. Louis, but it's not clear who paid for the airline ticket. Once back in Chelsea, the boys disagreed about what to do next. Jim suggested they start working for his father and they could build up enough money to leave that way, but Robert wanted to commit another crime. Jim told him he just wanted to graduate and start working. They had checked the news and didn't see any reports of advancements in the investigation, so they were hoping they were in the clear. Of course, they didn't know that the police don't often release important details of a criminal investigation for that purpose. They don't want the killer to see their cards. So while Robert and Jim were starting to relax, Jim's name was being discovered by investigators and he was becoming a new suspect. On February 15th, detectives showed up at the Parker residence asking to speak with Jim. Jim's father, John, answered the door and invited the officers into the home. John gave the investigators the okay to question his son, and soon Jim was in the dining room being asked about the knives he had purchased online. Fortunately, though he and Robert had been disagreeing lately, they had agreed on a story, should anybody ask about the knives or the matching sheaths. Jim explained that he had ordered the knives, one for himself and one for his friend Robert. It was the first time the authorities had heard the name Robert Tulloch. Jim said that they didn't like the knives, so they sold them to a guy at the Army-Navy surplus store. Not to the store itself, but to a guy they met there. He gave a rough description of the buyer, but said he didn't know his name. The detectives were a little suspicious of Jim's story, but they had a hard time believing that the kid would have murdered the Xantops. Up until they arrived in Chelsea, they didn't know Jim Parker's age. It wasn't until they stopped at the local sheriff's office to get directions that they learned that he was only 16 years old. Once they were done with the interview, they asked Jim if he would go to the sheriff's office to get fingerprinted, and he agreed. At the sheriff's office, Jim was questioned again, but the detective was more focused on who Jim had supposedly sold the knives to. He felt like he was lying, but he didn't think he was the murderer, so he assumed he was lying about who the buyer was. After more pushing, Jim insisted that he didn't know the person he sold the knives to. Then investigators went to the Tulloch home and spoke with Robert. He told them the exact same story that Jim did. Jim had purchased the knives online. They didn't like them, so Jim sold them to some guy at the Army-Navy store. The detectives noted that Robert was less nervous than Jim, and he openly showed them the cut on his leg. He claimed he had walked into the woods to take a leak and got cut by a maple tree spigot. Then the detectives asked if they could see Robert's shoes. It was something they hadn't asked of Jim. Robert went up to his room and returned with 2 pairs of shoes, Nike sneakers and Vask hiking boots. The bloody shoe prints at the scene had been determined to have come from a Vask boot, so then the detective asked if he could take them. Wanting to remain cool, Robert said it was fine. Robert was also asked to go to the sheriff's office and be fingerprinted, and he agreed. After he and Jim were both done, they were able to go back home. It was a mistake that the authorities would not live down. As soon as the boys were out of the sheriff's office, they knew they had to flee. Their parents were keeping an eye on them, but they were able to get messages to each other with a plan to meet up. They each packed clothes, fishing hooks, a compass, duct tape, matches, a flashlight, and a Boy Scout's handbook for boys. One thing they didn't pack was the knives. They met up nearby and fled the area, leaving the knives behind to be found by authorities. With little money and knowing the authorities would soon be looking for Jim's Audi, their plan was to make it to California by hitching rides with truckers. They got turned around while trying to find a truck stop and pulled into a service station where they asked a tow truck driver for directions. Once they got their bearings, they took off and the tow truck driver didn't think much more about it. The following morning, he would see the faces of those same boys on a news report about two fugitive teenagers. He quickly called the New Hampshire police and gave them their first good lead. Both the Parkers and the Tullocks knew their sons had left pretty quickly after they had, but they still believed they weren't involved in a murder. They assumed the pair were going to talk about the stressful ordeal and would be back in the morning. When they realized that wasn't going to happen, they alerted authorities and a manhunt began at about 11 a.m. on February 16th. They quickly turned their focus to the boys as the main murder suspects and got warrants to search both houses. While they waited, investigators were informed that a fingerprint on one of the knife sheaths found at the crime scene matched Jim. Once the warrants were issued, two teams of investigators searched the teenagers' rooms at the same time. They were pretty ordinary bedrooms. They collected writings, electronics, footwear, clothing, and to their surprise, they found two SOG Seal 2000 knives in Robert's room hidden inside a cardboard box. Forensic testing would later reveal blood on both knives that would be matched by DNA to Rolf and Susanna Zantop. Robert and Jim ended up at the Sturbridge Isles truck stop in Massachusetts where they asked for a ride from rowdy Kyle Tucker, but he said no. His wife and driving partner had more of a soft spot and convinced Kyle to let them hop on board. The teens told the couple that their names were Sam and Tyler and that they were trying to make it to California. They were able to take the boys south towards Pennsylvania. They dropped them off at a TA truck stop where the teens met a man named James Hicks who was headed to Chicago. While Robert and Jim were fast asleep in the cab of the truck headed west, investigators were hot on their trail. They had received the report from the tow truck driver and that led them to the Sturbridge Isles truck stop. Surveillance footage from the truck stop showed the boys getting into the cab of a white Peterbilt with green flames on the side. They were able to trace the owner and use the truck's GPS to track their location. Authorities weren't aware that the fugitives had already gotten onto a different truck and so they quietly tracked the Tuckers' Peterbilt as they pulled into a truck stop to get some sleep. A few hours later, their truck was surrounded by FBI agents and a SWAT team. The drivers described where and when they dropped the boys off, and the investigators continued to follow their trail. Early the following morning, James Hicks called out over his radio looking for any truckers headed west who could give Sam and Tyler a ride. A man responded that he could give the boys a ride, and they made plans to meet at the Flying J truck stop in Spiceland, Indiana. There, a local sheriff's deputy had heard the news of fugitive teenagers headed west, and when he heard the call looking for a ride, he became suspicious. Even if they weren't the fugitives, they were clearly teenagers hitching a ride across the country, and it might be worth looking into. When the truck pulled into the Flying J and the boys exited the cab, the deputy and his backup grabbed them and asked to see their IDs. They said they didn't have any and tried to give fake names, but the deputy wasn't buying it. They matched the description of the teens on the run, so they were placed under arrest. Eventually, their identities were confirmed. Both James Hicks and the Tuckers were fired from their respective employers for breaking company policy regarding hitchhikers. Upon seeing the news of the murder and the capture of two teenagers, Andrew Patty couldn't believe it. One of the faces on the television was the same person who had stood at his door claiming he had car trouble. His gut was right, and he had saved himself and his son from a potentially horrifying end. The next day, both boys' parents were in Indiana visiting their sons. Jim's parents had already hired a lawyer, and he advised Jim not to say anything, and that's what he did. He remained silent. Robert, on the other hand, well, he seemed all too willing to spill the beans. In his interview, through tears, he talked about how he had ruined his and Jim's lives and asked the detective if he would be tried as an adult. Robert's parents and lawyer would eventually advise him not to speak to investigators, but it was too late. Robert and Jim were extradited to New Hampshire, where they would be tried for first-degree murder. Robert was already eligible to be tried as an adult, but the prosecutor decided to try Jim as an adult as well. His parents and lawyer fought to keep him in juvenile court where the maximum sentence would still have him be released at the age of 21, but the prosecutor cited the heinousness of the crime along with it being carried out during the commission of a robbery. Once that was finalized, Jim took a deal to plead guilty of second-degree murder and testify against Robert in exchange for a sentence of 25 years to life. With good behavior, he could possibly be released in 16 years. The deal was criticized by the community, but the authorities believed that Robert was the ringleader and Jim was the weak link that would ensure he went to prison for life. At his sentencing hearing, Jim cried and apologized for what he had done. Robert's defense tried to get him a mental illness diagnosis so he could plead guilty due to reason of insanity, but they couldn't make it happen. After that, Robert changed his plea to guilty for the charge of first-degree murder. At his sentencing, he said nothing and showed no remorse as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jim Parker was released on parole in June of 2024 after having spent more than 20 years behind bars. He was a model inmate while inside, even earning a master's degree. It's too soon to say if he has changed and will stay out of trouble, but based on his clean prison record and amount of remorse, it seems promising. Robert, on the other hand, is having his sentence reviewed as the Supreme Court had determined it unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to a life sentence without parole. His case is currently under review and the court could re-sentence him to life in prison without parole or could impose a different sentence. Even if they re-sentence him to life in prison with the possibility of parole, that doesn't mean he'll get it. I was a bored teenager in a small town in the 90s, and I get that breaking free can seem like the only hope for your sanity. But killing people in order to steal money to leave just makes you a monster. Many young people find a way out of their small towns without resorting to murder. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.